Here's a video set on the characteristics of living organisms. So, characteristics of life. All living organisms share characteristics that separate them from non-living things. The 7 characteristics of life are cellular organization, so things need to be composed of cells. Reproduction, so they can reproduce both sexually and asexually. Metabolism, meaning it can eat and use food for energy. Homeostasis, which means it can maintain a stable internal. Heredity, which means that it is passing on its genetic information to offspring, and it has evolved over time or changed its genetics over time. Responsiveness, so it interacts and is dependent on other living organisms. And then the 7th characteristic of life is it grows and develops. So it converts biological molecules for growth, development, and work. So cellular organization, all things are made up of one or more cells. It is the smallest unit of life. There are 2 types of cells. Both cells are surrounded by a membrane. Our first type of cell is a prokaryote. So prokaryotic cell has no membrane-bound organelles. So no nucleus, no mitochondria, no Golgi, no ER. All of those things hopefully are a review, and we'll learn them later. The example of a prokaryote is a bacteria. So bacteria are our only prokaryotes. They're small, they're simple. This is actually an example right here of a bacteria cell. Eukaryotic cells are membrane-bound organelles. Cells with membrane-bound organelles, they're a little bit bigger, a little bit more complex. It's any cell that is not a bacteria, so animals, plants, fungus, and protists. And that's kind of interesting because those are the 4 kingdoms of the eukaryotic domain. So here's an example of a prokaryotic cell. Again, very simple. Notice no nucleus and very few organelles. And a eukaryotic cell here, we've got lots of organelles in here, lots of structure and folds, membrane-bound organelles, complex and much larger. So how does the organization of life extend from the cell? So we go from a cell to a tissue, to an organ system, and then to an organism. From that organism, we then have a population. The population becomes a community, and the community becomes an ecosystem. So this whole set right here is from cell to ecosystem is the organization of life. This is just a cellular organization example. A cell goes to a tissue goes to an organ goes to an organ system, a group of organ systems becomes an organism. This is an example of something that has cell structure and cell organization. It might not seem like a living thing, but it's still going to metabolize, it's still going to reproduce, grow and develop, etc. Reproduction. So the next characteristic of life is reproduction. All life is involved with making more of their own kind. So that's really important. All life is involved with making more of their own kind. There are 2 types of reproduction. Sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction gives you genetically unique offspring. And asexual reproduction, for example, binary fission in bacteria, where they're just simply splitting and creating identical offspring. So both produce offspring. Sexual reproduction produces genetically unique offspring, which is important for the evolution and development of populations and communities. And asexual reproduction is good for things that want to grow fast, especially bacteria. Metabolism is the next characteristic of life, and it's the sum of all the chemical reactions in the body. These chemical reactions allow organisms to obtain and use energy. Primary sources for energy are sunlight and inorganic chemicals, and also organic nutrients. What carries energy in our cells? This thing called ATP. So ATP is like our currency in our body that we are able to use to give us fuel. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Homeostasis is our next characteristic of life. Homeostasis is an organism's ability to maintain a stable internal condition or environment. Examples of homeostasis are an acid-base balance, body temperature. So in humans, we maintain our body temperature by sweating if we're hot or by shivering if we're cold. Glucose concentration, calcium levels, fluid volume, and blood pressure. Heredity is our next characteristic of life, and this is where we have passing on of genetic material from one generation to the next. and this is done through DNA. So DNA is the organism in which contains all the genetic material. The ways that organisms pass on DNA are conjugation, binary fission in bacteria. Binary fission in bacteria is a form of asexual reproduction, and then sexual reproduction. Conjugation is not a true form of reproduction, and we'll get more into that when we talk more about bacteria. Here's a diagram of conjugation, and it's really just an exchange of genetic material. And again, we'll get more into that when we start talking about bacteria. Responsiveness. So all life must adapt or respond to its environment, both immediately and long term. Short-term adaptations require the organism to respond to a stimulus. A stimulus is anything that causes a reaction in a cell, tissue, or organ. A stimulus can be external or internal. An example of a stimulus that would require an immediate response, things could be pain, heat, cold, loud noises. Examples of a stimulus that would cause a response resulting in populations adaptation, climate change, deforestation, weather, etc. Growth and development is our next characteristic of life. So what's the difference between growing and developing? All organisms grow, so all organisms get larger, and mature, so they develop. So there's differences between the two. Some mature more drastically than others. An example in nature would be a frog. It's growing because it's getting bigger, but it's also developmental stages are drastically different than one another. And the other example is a butterfly. Again, we go from a caterpillar to a butterfly, very drastic developmental stage differences. So how do you define if something is alive or not? It's anything that exhibits all the characteristics of life is said to be an organism. This includes bacteria, protists, fungus, animals, and plants. These happen to be the kingdoms that all organisms are classified in. We will split bacteria into two different kingdoms, but protists, fungus, animals, and plants are all their own kingdom when we get to that. Lastly, when we talk about characteristics of life, we need to understand this thing called biotic and abiotic factors. So abiotic factors are anything that's not living, so the non-living chemical and physical parts of the environment that affect living organisms and the functioning of the ecosystem. So examples of an abiotic factor could be the geology, so rocks, sand, the water that's available, the weather, the climate, and the minerals involved in the soil. Lots of different abiotic factors. Biotic factors are all of the living organisms within an ecosystem. So, one way to help prepare yourself and study is following these directions. This helps you use your Cornell Notes as a study tool. So if you go through and chunk your notes out, you're going to get the different sections. Those different sections, if you ask a question on the left of those different sections that will help you study, you can use the fold-over method and quiz yourself on those questions. And the summary on the bottom should answer those questions and also back to the essential question on the top of the notes. That's a great opportunity to get 3 or 4 different repetitions with the notes and study the material. Thanks for taking these.